From DataStax, this is the Distributed Data Show podcast.
When I was gathering interviews for my DataStax Accelerate episode on Cassandra Kubernetes, I interviewed a lot of experts. Most of them were outside of DataStax. But in one case, I talked to Chris Bradford, who is also an employee at DataStax. Now, he has a special opinion because he's actually a product manager for our Kubernetes part of our business. He's been a consultant. He's worked on our product side. He has a well-rounded opinion. And so when he and I got to talking about Kubernetes and Cassandra, it was much more about the actual product. And so there were some really cool insights into like how Kubernetes got to where it is and how it got to where it is with Cassandra and really about the future. And it's a different way of looking at it. I thought the full version would be helpful and useful to everyone if you saw it. So here it is in its full form. I hope you enjoy it. So Kubernetes seems to be the people's choice for deploying applications now. So why do you think that is? I mean, this is now a thing.
So Kubernetes is pretty amazing when it comes to deploying applications and making scaling pretty effortless. I think it came out of the Borg paper at Google, and even if you don't have a hyperscale problem or application, you still want to plan for that kind of thing and what scaling looks like. And so as we talk about scaling applications, specifically stateless ones, it's really a nice, like it's the match made in heaven, right? The peanut butter to the chocolate. It's a really good fit for those kinds of technologies. And it's pretty turnkey if your application is stateless, and usually the application tier is, to use Kubernetes and to scale pretty effortlessly with it.
Is stateless the key here with applications and Kubernetes?
It was for a long time. And if you asked me this question a number of years ago about, well, can we run Cassandra or databases on Kubernetes? I would have been like, you really shouldn't do that. It's been interesting to see how it grows. And that's one of the things that previously, if you had asked about whether or not you could run a stateful application, if everything in your stack was already using Kubernetes, you had all your tooling in place, your monitoring, your logging, and you're probably already a pretty advanced shop at that point. You know, maybe you can look at it for that kind of use case. But for most use cases, it required a deep understanding of the components inside of Kubernetes and the resources that it exposed. And you had to kind of carefully navigate those waters. And Kubernetes, the Kubernetes community and developers got together and said, you know what, we really want to be like the platform, and it doesn't make sense to just target stateless applications. That's not how you kind of grow in this space. Obviously, we can do that well, but there are other kinds of workloads that have an appetite to run on Kubernetes. And how can we solve that? And so they introduced new components like stateful sets, and persistent volumes and persistent volume claims to describe the pieces that you need to have to operate with stateful applications on Kubernetes. And so as those have matured, our stance and really anyone's stance when it comes to running a stateful application on top of Kubernetes has changed pretty significantly. And so rather than saying, no, you really don't want to do that, or you really have to understand X, Y, and Z, it's more of a, oh yeah, you can definitely do that. And this is the component that you leverage, and here's why it's a good fit. So
in that frame, like what happened with databases while the application tier was getting all the Kubernetes love along the way?
It's been interesting, and it depends on the type of databases that you look at, right? One of the things I think is pretty fascinating about Cassandra and how it has operated as a distributed system. It has a bunch of these components that you need to be effective in a distributed system. So look at things like Gossip and doing discovery and health checks and saying, are these nodes up? Do I need to route another way? Am I in a split brain scenario? Like all that's been kind of in the core of Cassandra since day one. And we're seeing the applications and frameworks on Kubernetes start to hit on those points as well. You can see it outside of Cassandra. Like you look at Elixir and Erlang, they kind of had some of those components built in, Pico, Akka as well. But we're seeing it more in the application layer now, whether you're looking at service meshes on top of Kubernetes, like Istio and Linkerd, or even just some of these components that are part of the platform itself. So when I talked about gossip, you have things like readiness and health checks built into Kubernetes at a platform level, not just within a framework. And so that's kind of how applications over time to become more cloud native. And then when we look at distributed systems or distributed databases like Cassandra, we see some very common parallels between the two. And they're all kind of playing field now versus in the past, we're like, oh, well, we have gossip to handle detecting if we can't talk to a node anymore, or we support multi-region replication out of the box, or we have this idea of failure zones built into the database layer. Well, we're also starting to see that in application now. And that's been pretty fascinating and really validating, if you will, to see those kinds of changes happen, where before it was kind of okay if an application instance went down because you would just take a load balancing pool and your app would stay up. As we get into more complex setups where you're doing routing based on where you are geographically to the closest data center, or based off of latency or different links, that kind of thing, it's tricky, right? And to see a lot of these components come up to the mainstream, come up to the prime time and be first-class citizens versus hidden away inside of the database layer is really nice.
So I think just as it goes with open source projects, whenever there's a good idea, a lot of things, there's a lot of energy around it. So now we have a lot of Kubernetes operators for Cassandra. And so do you think at this point there is a place for a common operator, or will there always be multiple operators?
Sure, and that's a great question. When I think about operators, there are a few different things that they try to solve, right? And the whole idea is to make it easier to deploy an application on top of Kubernetes. And an operator needs to be able to speak the Kubernetes side and the application domain side. In this case, let's talk about Cassandra. I need to be able to describe a Cassandra cluster to Kubernetes or to the operator, and then the operator describe that in the resources and components that Kubernetes speaks. And so is there a place for multiple operators? Well, I think that you have different missions, right? A lot of people, there's a common mission, which is I want to run Cassandra on Kubernetes. But then there's also, how do we go about doing that? Do we have any specific implementation details that are unique to our environment? Or maybe we have certain compliance concerns. So it would be very short-sighted of me to say, no, there's one operator to rule them all and in the darkness bind them, right? But it's very much what's your use case? And if the operator is open source, well, that's fascinating. I'd love to see an operator that's extendable to support many different use cases and workloads and target 80% of the Cassandra deployments out there. I still think there are going to be some other deployments where it's not necessarily possible, or there are certain requirements that don't allow that specific operator to be used. But it would also be nice for it to be a jumping off point if you do have to make your own operator.
Yeah, and having it closer aligned with the project is helpful, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah. So what do you think what are the important features of a Kubernetes operator? And the most important things, what's the must-have for a Kubernetes operator for Cassandra?
Sure. So a Kubernetes operator for Cassandra has to understand, like I said before, it has to understand the business domain, or the application domain of Cassandra. So there are some concepts that I think need to be baked into it from the get-go, and what I like to call table stakes. And if I'm looking at open source Cassandra, or any Cassandra really, and I'm thinking, what are the tenets for running a successful cluster in the space? Am I looking at this needs to be multi-region and do geographic geolocation of data? Or do I need to support multiple data centers from a workload isolation perspective? When we start working on Kubernetes, it likes to do things like reuse IP addresses. And inside of the core of Cassandra, we talk about IP addresses and ports all over the place. Kubernetes is like, I really like host names, so I can change the IPs on as I see fit. And it'd be nice to see some of the bridging between those, what the requirements look like for each of those technologies. So table stakes, I think you have multi-region support, and that's non-trivial. If you look at what is happening in the multi-region or multi-cluster space for Kubernetes, they're very tricky They like to say, okay, well, just deploy the same resources in all these other clusters, and then you route traffic to the appropriate cluster, and you're good to go. And if we were a stateless application, yeah, sure, that'd be super easy, and we could just go on with our day. But we're a stateful application, and we need to replicate between those regions, and it gets a lot hairier, swirlier there, right? So we have to do things like quorum across multiple regions. We have to make sure that pods within the network can then communicate between clusters. So there are a number of pieces there. One of the things that I think is table stakes as well is when you start talking about connectivity to the Cassandra cluster. If you're running your application within Kubernetes and you're talking to a Cassandra cluster running within the same Kubernetes cluster, that's pretty easy. You just say, okay, here's my service, and it points at all my pods, and away we go, and we're happy. But what if you have a legacy application, or an application that exists outside of that Kubernetes cluster? What if you have an application in a separate Kubernetes cluster? How do you handle that discovery and communication across boundaries? Is it simple, where you just have a super flat network and every container can talk to every other container? Or are you more security focused and you have different rules in place? What does that look like? And I think any operator that is going to operate in this space needs to understand we don't always have the simple use case of, oh, they can just talk to it, we're good to go. It might be a little bit more nuanced than that. And to speak to the different use cases or missions of your cluster or requirements of your environment, you might have a centralized logging system for your enterprise. And how you plug into that, the operator should allow you to do things like, say, I use this kind of logging system. How can I describe that to the operator so it gets plugged into all the Cassandra pods? Or I might have some auditing tool that needs to do something like that. It's kind of fascinating when you start to dig into some of the use case specific implementations, but you could see, like with logging, like we just discussed, I mean, that's centralized logging is awesome, but how you do centralized logging, there's a handful of different ways you can do that. And do you do that with a separate key inside of your custom resource, or do you make it so you can kind of plug in what you need? So that's one of the things I think is worth taking into mind as you start to build out on operators. How can we support some of these varied deployments while still applying things like best practices, high availability, and all that comes with Cassandra out of the box?
The leveling for the Kubernetes operator is a good guidepost, I think. Like the level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where do you fit in this? I definitely think level 3 is a minimum of just being able to do lifecycle management. Mm-hmm. But there's some parts of level 5, for instance, horizontal scaling, which I think that comes with it.
I've been very happy to see, so Operator Hub is a website where you can get operators for different technologies. Mm-hmm. And they have a 5-point scale for how mature is your operator. And that's very fascinating, where it can just be like, I install things and you're done. Or it can be proactive, such as I monitor your instances and I see that one of them went down and I can make sure that we start one up. Or if there's timing between starting different instances, that's kind of fascinating when we talk about Cassandra. You don't just start all the nodes at one day. Whoa, hey, we have a cluster. You have to say, okay, well, we start these nodes first, these nodes second, these nodes third, and an operator, some of the more interesting operators, complex operators, will handle all that timing for you.
All right, so what about the future? And so if we're gonna get some usable level of a Kubernetes operator with Cassandra, so what kind of new use cases does that enable? What does the future hold for us?
So it's interesting as we start to think about the logical concept of a Cassandra cluster or a Cassandra data center and talking to an operator. It's almost like a conversation, right? Say, I need a cluster with this capacity or to fit these kinds of availability constraints. I think it's kind of fascinating to see that kind of sprout. That's like putting the seeds in the ground, but we want to talk about what does the garden look like. And there are a number of operators out there, not just for Cassandra, but for complementing technologies. So we talked about logging. You can also do monitoring. You can do backup solutions. You can do, in the case of Cassandra, you have repairs. And so that's kind of interesting. How can we as an operator, enable those other technologies as well, whether that's within the scope of our cluster or talking directly to other operators and being more of a like a mesh, just to say, okay, I need an enterprise deployment of Cassandra. What does that look like? Well, it's not just running Cassandra. You have repairs, backups, monitoring, logging. There's all these other pieces that go into it. And maybe your operator doesn't control all of those things, but maybe it enables the use of other operators or other components to do this. And that's where I think our future state is. It's turnkey in a way that we kind of saw with the rise of cloud players, where you can say, this is what I'm looking for, and all of that automation happens for you. And cognitively, you can focus on your application or your business needs and think less about what order do I start these nodes in again, or did I run the backup? What's the schedule for that look like? Or we're getting ready to change our logging solution. This is going to be awful. Like, it would be really nice to not have to have that cognitive load, that cognitive burden, and just be like, okay, we can do that and get on with the more interesting parts of our day.
I really love the concept of reducing cognitive burden. I think this is going to be crisis level if we don't really have a hard think about how we do infrastructure and what we put on developers. It's getting in the way of progress.
Definitely. And I think about, I used to work in a network operations center, and I think about the long nights where it was super early in the morning and the reporting jobs would kick off and the database servers would get super hot as they were getting queried for metrics collection and generating reports. I'm like, man, I remember being 4 a.m. and those servers still being bright red and having to start waking people up. And I think about operators, specifically Kubernetes operators, and it's always watching, it's always monitoring, whether it's the reporting hour or it's a physical worker died and I need to remediate. The time between monitoring, picking it up, and the human seeing that monitoring picked it up, and then remedial action and taken, and all the further downstream events can be significantly shortened, is fantastic. So I love to put my operator hat on when I start thinking about distributed systems and Cassandra. I'm like, well, it's kind of awful to think about some of the things that we had to automate and do to get it usable and robust, and we're next leveling that every single week, it feels like now, with the automation that's coming out.
That would be a really cool future to see. Cassandra being, it's an easy thing to work with. Working with Kubernetes makes it so that it's just an easy thing to say. You can go into kube control, deploy, and done. Don't have to worry about it that much.
I think it enables a whole new class of workflows as well. I really like this whole CICD pipeline, and I'd love to talk to developers as they're building out their schema and say, okay, this is the schema you want to roll with. This is what you've checked in. Let's go ahead and spin up a cluster. Let's run some data against that. Let's see what your performance looks like. Let's see what your data size looks like on disk. Let's see X, Y, and Z, and make sure that you're checking off all these boxes as you do that road to production versus, oh, we just hit production and we didn't account for this edge case or that edge case, and it's all blowing up on us. I'd love to see this continuous data platform kind of come into existence. And I think with the right tooling in place, you can leverage it and make that happen.
I think you're right. I see it, and I think a lot of other people see it. That's why you see all this activity around operators. They're like, this is the future we all want and deserve.
Yes, definitely.
Chris Bradford is one of my go-to people, and now you see why. He has so much information that he can offer. Every time I talk to him, I learn a little bit more. And whenever I get really stumped or I have problems with Cassandra and Kubernetes and trying to figure out how things are working together, a quick Zoom call with Chris and things are cleared up right away. So thanks again to Chris for joining me on this. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Distributed Data Show. Please subscribe with your favorite podcast